In this video, after I show you how to create this simple weather app using VueJS 3, the Composition API and the OpenWeatherMap API, I'm going to show you how to hide your API key from your end users by using a Node.js and Express backend, and how to hide your API key from your Git repository using Dotenv and Environment Variables. If you're new here, my name's Danny. I'm an indie app developer and creator of VueJS. If you want to learn about Vue.js, web development, app development, and all that good stuff, click subscribe and click the bell. Every subscription helps me to create more content for this channel. So what we're going to do in this video is create a new Vue 3 project and create this simple weather app where we can enter a city and grab the weather and display the weather for that city by using the OpenWeatherMap API. And it's not the prettiest thing, but if you want to learn how to create a beautiful weather app, then check out my weather app video. But at this point, our API key is going to be exposed to the end user. So we can see our request here. If I click on that, you can see our API key here. So what we're going to do is set up a Node.js and Express backend, which will store our API key and do the API call for us. And at this point, if I just do another request here and click on this, at this point, our API key will be hidden from the end user. And we can't see it in this request here. And to finish off, in case we want to share our code with other developers, I'm going to show you how to hide the API key from your source code, from your Git repository, by using environment variables and a package called Dotenv. Let's get started by creating a new Vue 3 project with the Vue CLI. So I'm just going to Google Vue CLI, jump to the website, get started, and installation. And if you don't have Node.js installed, you can install that from nodejs.org. You probably want to install the one on the left. And you should then be able to install the Vue CLI with this command in your terminal. And once that's installed, you should be able to create a new Vue project with the Vue create command. So I'm going to jump to my terminal, which is just running within VS Code, which is the editor I'm using. And I'm just going to run Vue create. Let's call it Vue-node-hide-API-key. And you want to choose manually select features. And using the spacebar, I'm going to enable the router and enable CSS preprocessors. And I'm going to disable the linter, although you might want to consider using the linter on your own projects, especially if you're working in teams. Then I'm going to choose version 3, no to history mode. And I'm going to use some Sass in this, so I'll choose Sass with SCSS in dedicated config files. Save this as a preset, I'm going to choose no. Okay, it's finished creating our project and it tells us we can launch it by running npm run serve in that folder. So I'm going to drag the folder it's created into VS Code, open up the terminal and just run npm run serve. And the app is now running, so we can just command and click on this link and it will open it up in the browser. Let's design a really basic weather app on this homepage. So I'm going to jump to source and views and home.view. I'm just going to remove everything inside this div with a class of home. So get rid of that. And I'll get rid of this hello world import. We don't need that. And we don't need this components object. And I'm going to jump into the components folder and delete the hello world component as well. And I'll save this home.view. And we now just have an empty page. Okay, so let's add some markup in this div here. So I'm going to add a h1 and just put the text weather app. And then I'm going to add a div with a class of enter city, where we're going to put our input. So I'll add an input here. And I'm going to split the attributes on that with the split HTML attributes extension. And I'll add a placeholder and set that to enter a city. And then after this div, I'm going to add another div with a class of weather, where we're going to display our weather information. I'll add a h1, where we can display the temperature. So I'll just put 6 degrees for now. So 6 and then DEG, semicolon, to output a degree symbol. And then under that, I'll add a h2 where we can display the weather type. So I'll just put cloudy. And then under that, I'll add a h3 where we can display the description. So I'll just put lots of clouds for now. And I'll save that. And I'm just going to add a little bit of CSS to style this up a bit. So I'm going to add a style section. And in fact, let's use Sass. So I'm going to set the lang equal to Sass. And I'm going to target this input in this enter city div. So I'll add .enter-city, then a new line and an indentation, and then we'll target the input. And I'll set the font size to 40 pixels, save that. And we now have a nice big input. Let's style up the text in this weather div. So we'll target this weather div, this div with a class of weather. And we'll add a bit of top margin to this. So I'll set margin-top to, let's say, 10 pixels. And inside this weather div, I'll target this H1. So I'll add H1 here. And we'll set the font size to 80 pixels to make the temperature nice and big. And I'm also going to remove the default margin on all of these headings. So I'm going to target the H1, the H2, and the H3. And just set the margin to 0. And this is looking good enough now. Okay, let's set up some data and methods. And I'm going to use the composition API and a reactive object for this. And if you need to learn the basics of the composition API, then check out my composition API video. So I'm going to remove this name property in our export and add our setup method. And I'm going to use a reactive object to store our data. So we need somewhere to store our city and somewhere to store the weather data. So I'm going to use a reactive object for this. So I'm going to import reactive from Vue. And I'm going to set up an object called data, set that equal to a reactive object like this. And we'll add a property for our city, set that to an empty string. And we'll add a property for our weather data. I'm just going to call this weather, and I'll set that to null by default. And to use this data object in our view, we need to return it at the end of this setup method. So I'll add a return statement and just pass in data. Let's bind this city property to our input here. So I'll add a vmodel and I'll set that equal to data.city and save that. And to see if that's working, I'll just put a value in here for now and save that. And yeah, that seems to be hooked up okay. So I'll set this back to an empty string. Okay, so when the user hits enter in this field, I want to trigger a method which will get some data from the OpenWeatherMap API. So I'm going to jump to this input and add a key up handler and add the .enter modifier. So this will be fired whenever we hit the enter key in this field, and we'll fire a method called getWeather. Let's create this method. So I'll make this a const. So const getWeather. And set this equal to a function. And for now, we'll just log out getWeather. And we need to add this function to this return statement. So I'll add that here, getWeather, and I'll save that. And let's just see if this method is being fired. So if I hit enter in this field, we can see getWeather in the console. Okay, so when this getWeather method is fired, we want to grab some data from the OpenWeatherMap API and display it down here. So I'm going to jump to openweathermap.org. And if you don't have an account, just go to sign in and then create an account and create an account. And then once you've created an account, you should sign in. And if you then go to this drop down and my API keys, you should be able to find your API key here. So I'm just going to copy this for later. And then I'm going to jump to the API page, and we're going to use this current weather data API. So I'm going to click on API doc, and it gives us an example API call here. So I'm going to copy this and paste it into another tab. And I'm going to replace the app ID with my API key, which I just copied. And I'll replace this city name here. I'll just replace this with Manchester for now, and I'll hit enter. And we can see some weather data for Manchester. So we can see the name of the weather and the weather description, and we can see our temperature here. And it's in kelvins by default, and we can change this to metric or imperial. So I'm going to jump back to the API page, scroll down to parameters, and we can use this units parameter and set that to metric or imperial. So I'm just going to add that to our query string here. So after this question mark, I'll just add units equals metric, but you can use imperial if you like. And then I'll just add an and symbol, hit enter. And these temperatures are now in metric. So I'm going to use Axios to reach out to this API. So I'm going to jump back to our project and kill the dev process with Control and C. and just run npm install Axios. And that's now installed. So I'm just going to launch our project again with npm run serve. And that's now running again. So I'm just going to refresh our page. We need to import Axios before we can use it. So I'm going to import Axios from Axios. And then in this getWeather method, we're going to use Axios to reach out to this API URL. So I'm going to copy this and paste it in here as a string. I'm just going to enable word wrap. And after this, we'll add a then block, which should give us a response. And I'll just log out that response and save that. Let's see if that's working. So I'll just type in a city name, hit enter. And if we look in the console, we can see we have some data. And all of the weather data is in this data property. So we can see the temperature in this main object here. And if we go into this weather property, we can see the weather name and the weather description as well. Okay, so now we want to display this weather data on the page down here. And before we do that, I'm just going to tidy this up a bit. So I'm going to put the API URL into a constant. So I'm going to copy from weather here to the start, copy that and set up a constant. And we'll call this API URL. Paste that in there, and then we'll interpolate that. So I'll select up to /weather, delete that, and just add $ and then curly braces. And we need to change this into a template string. So I'll change these quotes to backticks here and here. And inside these curly braces, we'll just put API URL. And I'll also put our API key into a constant. So I'll set up a constant called API key. And we'll just copy that from here and paste it here. And then we'll interpolate that. So $ curly braces and then API key. And we're currently hard coding the query here, the city. So I'm just going to delete Manchester and instead interpolate this city property from our reactive object. So I'll just put data.city in here. And I'll save that and reload and make sure it's still working. So I'll type in Manchester. And yeah, we can see some data for Manchester. Or if I type in New York, then we see some data from New York. So once we've got this data, we want to put this data property into this weather property in our reactive object so that we can display it in our template. So what we want to do in this then block, I'll get rid of this console log, and we can just do data.weather equals response.data. And then after that, I'm just going to log out data.weather to make sure we've got the right data in there. So I'll reload, search for a city, and we can see our data in here. So let's display the temperature first. So this is going to be at weather.main.temp. So I'll scroll up to the template and replace this number 6 with double curly braces and weather.main.temp. And I'll save that. And let's see if that's working. And we have an error here, cannot read property main of undefined. And that's because when we initially load the app, we have nothing in this weather property. So let's hide this weather div if we don't have any weather data. So I'm going to split the attributes and add a v-if directive and set that to data.weather. So only display this div if we have some data in this weather property. So I'll save that and reload, search for a city. And we're still seeing this error, cannot read property main of undefined. And that's because I should be putting data.weather.main.temp here. I think I was thinking in terms of the options API then. So I'll save that. And we can now see the temperature for Manchester. It doesn't look that great with a decimal place, so let's round that up. So I'll just fire math.round on this and save that. And that looks better. So now we want to output the name of the weather. Just open up this proxy object. So this is going to be at weather and then first item in the array, and then main. So I'll replace this cloudy text with double curly braces and data.weather.weather, and then first item in the array, and then .main. Save that. And we can now see clouds here. And let's get the description. So this is going to be at the same again, except .description at the end. So I'll just copy this and paste it in this H3 and change this last bit to description. Save that. And we can now see the description on the page. So we can now remove this console.log. And I'll just save this and try a couple of different cities, make sure it's working. So Manchester and London and Sydney. And yeah, it all seems to be working. So what's the problem here? Well, if I just jump to the network panel in Chrome DevTools and clear all of the requests and make a new request, you can see our request here. If we click on that and just drag this over, we can see our API key here. So anybody that's using this app can get our API key and maybe use it for their own devious purposes. And this might not be a big issue when you're using a free API like this, but if you're using an API that you're paying money for, then you really don't want other people to get access to your API key because it could really cost you dearly. And as well as in the network panel, they will also be able to grab it from your source code as well. If we go to sources, then JS, then app.js, and if I just search for app ID, actually API key, then we can see it there as well. Let's set up a Node.js and Express backend, which can do our OpenWeatherMap API call for us so that this API key isn't exposed to our end users in the front end of our app. So I'm going to jump back to my editor and show the sidebar. And at the root of our project, I'm going to create a new folder called Backend. And this is where I'm going to place my backend. And you might want to place it in a completely separate project, but just for simplicity, I'm just going to place it here. I'm just going to show the terminal and open up a new terminal by clicking on this plus symbol. And I'm going to cd into that backend folder. And to initialize a new node project, I'm just going to run npm init. And then I'm just going to hit enter on all of these options, but you can fill some of them in if you want. But I'm just going to hit enter on all of these. And it's now initialized our node project. If we go into this backend folder, we can see a package.json file. And we can see this is going to look for a file called index.js. So let's create that file in this folder. So index.js. And I'm going to be using Express to set up this backend. So I'm just going to jump to expressjs.com. And this is a really simple framework, which makes it really easy to create Node apps and especially to create APIs. And we do need to install this into our backend folder. So make sure you're in the backend folder and just run npm install express. And you don't need to add --save on newer versions of Node. So I'm just going to run this. And that's finished installing. So I'm going to jump to getting started and hello world. And we have this simple hello world example here. So I'm just going to copy this code and paste it into this index.js file. So I'll just briefly explain what's going on here. So on this first line, we're just requiring the Express framework. Then we're just setting up a new Express app so that we can do something with it. And we're just setting the port that this app is going to run on. And here we're just setting up an endpoint at the path /, which when we hit that endpoint, it's just going to return the text hello world to the browser. And this app.listen is basically just launching our app on the port that we're specifying here. So I'm going to save this. We can launch this app by just running node and index.js. But if we do it that way, we won't have auto server restarting when we make changes to our code. So instead, I'm going to use a package called nodemon, which will give us auto server restarting. So I'm just going to run npm install nodemon. And that's now installed. So to launch our app with nodemon, we can just run nodemon and then the name of our file, index.js. And that's now running. And it says that it's running at localhost :3000. So if I command and click on that, we can see hello world in the browser, which is coming from this endpoint here. And if we change this text to hello worlds and save that, we could see Node.js has restarted the server. So if we reload the page, it now says hello worlds. Okay, so let's use this endpoint here to make the request to the OpenWeatherMap API for us so that we can hide our API key from our front end. So back to our front end, so home.view. Instead of reaching out to the OpenWeatherMap API in the front end, let's reach out to this endpoint here in our backend instead. So this is going to be at localhost :3000. So I'll jump to home.view and we'll update this string here to localhost 3000. But before we do that, I'm just going to copy this and paste it into our backend because we're going to need that later. But I'll just comment it out for now. And we'll change this here to https://localhost :3000 and /. And I'll just save that. So we're now sending this query string to our backend, to this endpoint, instead of to the OpenWeatherMap API. And so this endpoint will receive that query string, and that query string will be in this request object at request.query. And in fact, I'm just going to rename these to request response, just to make it a bit clearer what's going on here. And I'm going to remove this response.send. And for now, I'm just going to log out, console.log, request.query, and I'll save that. And if we jump back to our app, and so if we make a request now, Manchester, it looks like we have an error here. So SSL protocol error. And I think that's because I've set this API URL to HTTPS, and I think it should just be HTTP. So I'll get rid of the S, save that and reload and search for a city. And if we look in our terminal here, the terminal that's running the backend, we can see our query data here. So everything that we're sending in this query string here, the units, the queue parameter and the app ID parameter, is being received by our endpoint here, and we're logging that out, and it's being logged out as an object. Now we're still sending the API key from our front end here. So let's move this to our backend. So I'm going to cut this API key const from the front end and paste it into our backend here, and then back to home.view. I'm just going to remove this app ID property from the query string and save that, and save the backend as well. And if we reload and search for something, and we look in our backend terminal, we can see it's logging out the query object again, but now it doesn't have the app ID parameter that we need. It only has the units and the queue parameters. So let's add the app ID parameter to this query object and set it to this API key so that we have everything that we need to send to the OpenWeatherMap API. So in our endpoint here, I'm going to set up a new object called query and set that equal to request.query. And then we're going to add an app ID property to this query and set it to our API key. So we can just do query.appid equals API key. And now let's just log out this query object to make sure it's got everything we need. So we'll just log out query, and I'll get rid of this first console log and save that and reload the app and do a search. And if we now look in the terminal, we have everything we need to send to the OpenWeatherMap API in this object. So we've got the units, we've got the query, and we've got the app ID or the API key. But before we can make the request to the OpenWeatherMap API, we need to convert this object into a query string so that it looks something like this. And we can do this with a package called QS. So I'm going to search for QS package and jump to the QS page. And this package allows us to convert an object into a query string and vice versa. So to convert an object into a query string, we can just use this stringify method. So I'm going to jump back to our terminal, the backend one, and I'm going to kill the process with Control and C. And I'm going to run npm install QS. and that's now installed. So we need to require this library. So I'm going to copy this top line here and paste it up here. And we should now have access to this stringify method. So after we've finished setting up this query object, I'm going to set up a new variable called query string and set that equal to qs.stringify, and then pass in this query object which we've set up. And then we'll log out this query string instead of logging out the query object. And I'll save that. And we need to launch the backend again with nodemon index.js. And that's now running. So if I jump back to our app and reload and do a search, and we look in the terminal, we can now see our query string being logged out with the 3 different parameters: units, queue, and app ID. So we now have everything we need to make our request to the OpenWeatherMap API. So let's use Axios again to make our request. So I'm going to kill the backend process and run npm install Axios. And that's now installed. So I'll launch our project again with nodemon index.js. And to use Axios, we need to require it. So we can just do const Axios equals require, and then Axios. We should now be able to make our requests in this endpoint. So what we want to do is Axios, and I'll use a template string for this. So we want to reach out to the API URL, which we have in this const here. I'll just uncomment that. So we want to do $curly braces and then API URL. And then we need a question mark before we add the query string. And then we can just interpolate our query string. So $curly braces and query string. And then I'll add a then block. And by the way, you can use async await if you prefer, but I prefer using promises like this. And this will return a response from the API. And for now, we'll just log out the response. So console.log response. And I'll remove this other console log. And I'll save that and reload the app. We'll do a search. And if we look in our terminal now, we can see all the weather data being logged out. So this request to the API is now working. But we want to send this response data back to our front end so that it can then add it to this data property and display the data in our view. So I'll jump back to index.js. And what we can do after we have this response is we can use the send method on this response object to send something back to the browser. Although I've just realized that we've also named this response here. Might just change this to res. And what we can do is response.send, and we want to send the data object that's in this response. So we can just do response.send res.data. And I'll save that and let's see if this is working. So I'll reload the app and do a search. And we have an error here, access to XML HTTP request from origin. Localhost has been blocked by cause policy. No access control allow origin header is present on the requested resource. And this is because our front end doesn't currently have permission to receive data from the backend. And we can fix this by setting the access control allow origin header on this endpoint to any origin. And to do this, right at the top of our endpoint, we can just do response.set. Don't know what's going on with my indentation there. And we want to set this access control allow origin header. So I'm going to copy this from this error, paste that in here. And for the second parameter, we just want to add asterisk. And this means that any front end can have access to this endpoint here. So I'll save that and reload the app again. I'll do a search. And the app now seems to be working again. And I'll just do a couple more searches. So London and Sydney. And it all seems to be working. And if we jump back to our network panel and reload this and just clear all of the requests and do a search, we can see our request to our backend here. And if we click on that, we can now no longer see the API key. So our API key is now completely hidden from the end user. If you found this video useful so far, smash the like button and leave some love down in the comments. So we've hidden our API key from our end users, but what if we want to share this project on GitHub? Well, right now our API key is still in our source code in this index.js file. So if we put this project on GitHub, then any developer can access our API key and potentially use it and abuse it. So let's use environment variables and a package called Dotenv to remove our API key from our source code completely. So I'm just going to Google Dotenv and jump to the npm page. And this is a package which allows us to create a file called .env and place some variables in there. And .env will then grab those variables and make them available in our backend. So first of all, we need to install it with npm install .env. So I'm just going to copy this command, kill the backend process and install .env. And that's now installed. So if we scroll down to usage, it says as early as possible in your application, require and config .env. So I'm going to copy this line and I'll place this right at the top of our index.js file. And then it says create a .env file in the root directory of your project and add some variables like this. So I'm just going to save index.js and then I'm going to create a new file in the backend folder called .env. And we're going to add our API key here as a variable like this. So I'm just going to add API underscore key and set that equal to our API key. So I'm going to copy that from our index.js file here and paste that here, and I'll save that. And it says here process.env now has the keys and values you defined in your env file. So we can get access to these anywhere within our backend by just triggering process.env and then the name of our environment variable, which is API underscore key. So here where we're hard coding the API key, we can now just set this to process.env.api underscore key. And I'll save that and let's see if it's still working. So I'll reload the app and search for a city. And it's not working because the backend is not running. So let's launch the backend with nodemon index.js and try that again. I'll reload, search for a city. And yeah, still seems to be working. But now our API key is in this .env file instead of in our index.js file. However, by default, this env file will be added to our Git repo if we add this to a Git repo. And we can see that because the name of the file is in green here, which means that it will be added to the Git repo. Whereas if we look at these node modules folders, they have this dark gray color because they're not going to be committed to a Git repo. And that's because if we go to this git ignore file, we can see node modules has been added to this git ignore file, which is why those folders are going to be ignored by Git. So if we want this .env file to also be ignored by Git, we can just add to the bottom of this file backend/.env. And if I save that, we can now see the .env file has changed to dark gray. So that will no longer be committed to a Git repository. Alternatively, we can cut this out and save that and instead create another git ignore file in our backend folder. So .git ignore. And then in here, we can just add .env and I'll save that. And again, we see the .env file change to dark gray. Either way, our .env file is going to be ignored by Git and not added to our Git repository. However, if we are putting our project into a Git repo, then we probably want other developers to be able to launch this project, which they might not be able to do easily right now since they won't have this .env file. So let's just take a few steps to make it easy for other developers to launch this project. So what we could do is duplicate this env file. So I'm just going to right click on that and click on duplicate. By the way, if you don't see this option, you can use the duplicate extension, which you can find in the extension store. So I'm going to duplicate that and let's call it .env.sample. And we're not going to add this to our Git ignore list. We're going to actually commit this to our project. But we want to remove our API key here. So I'm just going to replace that with your API key here. And I'll save that. And so when another developer downloads our project, they can generate an API key and put it in here and rename this to just .env, and they should be able to launch the project. However, we should probably add some instructions telling them how to do this. So you could, if you want, create a README file in this backend folder, a readme.md file. But I'm just going to add some instructions to this readme.md file, which is already here in the root. So I'm going to open that up and jump to the bottom. We could add a heading here, which just says something like backend setup. We could put something like, for this project, you need both the front end and back end running at the same time. You will also need an API key. We can put some instructions here. So we could put something like, in the backend folder, rename .env.sample to .env. And I'll just put these in code blocks so it looks nice. Then we could put generate an API key at https://openweathermap.org, and then add your API key to backend/.env. Just put that in backticks. Then we could add another heading here, install dependencies, and a code block with npm install. And we should probably tell them to cd into the backend folder as well. And then we could add another heading which says launch the backend, and another code block with nodemon index.js. And I'll save that. I'll just right click this to preview it, make sure it looks okay. And yeah, this looks pretty good. And now any developer that downloads our code should be able to launch the project. And if you want to learn how to deploy an app like this, deploy the front end to Firebase hosting and deploy the back end to Heroku, then you might want to check out my Instagram clone series. Also check out my weather app video if you want to make a more beautiful weather app. Also, please hover my face and subscribe. Every subscription helps me to create more content for this channel. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.